Today we're going to talk about this idea of a devil. Have you ever seen this depiction here? If you've ever seen the Codex Gigas, it's a giant Bible, almost 3 foot. It's huge. Has all kinds of images in it, but strangely, it's got this one whole page dedicated to what was supposedly the devil. And what you're looking at here is something that has a lion's mane with a crocodile head on it, with a forked tongue like a snake and claws like a lion, although he wears a leopard skirt on to protect his posthumousness. And then he has horns on him. This is not the depiction of the devil that we normally have in our mind, where it's some guy who's red-skinned with horns with a pitchfork or a trident and so on. But whenever the Bible tried to disavow all of the, or not necessarily the Bible, but the people hooked up to Christianity, tried to disrespect all other forms of religion, they actually said that these were all demons. Of course, we should be of an age now where we understand this stuff doesn't exist. What they thought were demons a long time ago are things like germs and so on that cause problems. But it's not because there's some guy sneaking around somewhere doing some crap. But they had a lot of gods that were demons that were good. Like Pazuzu, which was falsely depicted in The Exorcist as of taking the young girl Rachel there and possessing her. Now, I'm not sure if any of you listening believe in exorcisms, or the fact that a child that's having some kind of mental problem or having seizures or things along these nature would actually somehow become possessed by the devil or a demon. But there was a long swath of time there where people, due to Christianity, you see, they're the ones that started all this, because in the Old Testament, Satan is really just the adversary. He's somebody that was hired and given placement by God to test people of their faith. That's all it really ever was. And so it never was the Satan as we think of today. But then again, Satan just means adversary, and it always did. So later in the Christian ideal, they took all of these people, like the god Pan, who is shown with goat horns and goat hooves and so on like that, and the fact that men used to wear red ochre wash on their bodies to cover them from the sun. This was done a lot in the Canaanite area, where we connect to the Phoenicians, which were a very much adept sailing and merchant people that were on a boat. I don't know if you've ever been on a boat for an afternoon, but you're liable to get a good suntan, if not a sunburn, because water is reflecting the light off from one direction and you have it penetrating from on top. But this picture that we're talking about here is something that was put in the Bible, that was made by supposedly a monk. And the weird tale that goes along with this is that he was going to be killed, and so he said that he would do something and give his soul to the devil or whatever, to be able to write a Bible. And so apparently it stated that overnight he was able to write and draw all of this book, where people looking into it said this could have took quite a few years and could not have been done in one night. But whenever they looked deep into it, they see that it looks like the same person writing. And I don't know if you're aware, but what you wrote like whenever you were a kid in high school is probably not exactly what you write like now. Your signature maybe even changed and things like this. But it appears that this was all written at the same time. But this is the depiction that they give of the devil. Nothing like what we have in our minds. But other than that fact, horned creatures. Oh, this makes something bad happen out of that. Surely, that has to be something bad. Well, the ancient Canaanites, the pre-proto-Israelites, if you would, worshipped a god known as El. And El is shown with horns too. Now, what's crazy about that is that people try to turn this into all kinds of things, but during the time of Taurus, the gods of that age, blah, 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 would have had horns on them. In fact, after that, we have Aries, which, of course, is hooked up to Jesus and these ideas, but at the same time, goats have horns too, don't they? And, of course, the goat of Mendez and all these things that people have put out, this goat idea, it's evil. In fact, in some depictions, the devil has eyes like a goat. In fact, you can look at things that they show, like the ancient god that the Knights Templar found, who was really just a depiction of a bunch of these theological ideas and wisdom put into one. It's kind of an androgynous creature, and of course they were already swept up into this, so they took that to being something like a devil. Now, these ancient Canaanites, they worshipped a god called Moloch as one of their gods, and they used to sacrifice their children to him with a creature that looked much like this. And if you look, it's really a cow man. I would say cowboy, but he's apparently mature, and so it's a cow man that they sacrificed their children to. In fact, when Moses comes down from the Mount Sinai with all of his 10 commandments, people don't usually read the whole thing there, but if they do, he comes down and sees that they're worshiping a bull. He smashes the tablets or whatever. You've probably seen the 10 Commandments, the movie, and doesn't like the fact that they've got a golden bull, but that's a golden bull that recreates a time of Taurus, even though this was written much later. And they say that you no longer do this, that what you do now is you sacrifice a ram or a goat. In fact, they took this so much to heart that they ended up making the horn that they blow, brrr, and this is a horn, a ram's horn that they blow. Now, whenever they tried to paganize and disavow all the others of religion all around the place, it's crazy that they have in the Bible, in Numbers, and I forget what the other one is, but it actually talks about whenever the Most High God allotted the lands and the gods to be over certain people, and that Yahweh was the people of Israel. And so all of these other 70 gods or whatever they had going at the time, which is a sacred geometry number, 72 if you will, and this shows that actually in the Bible that God himself, who's supposed to be talking at this time, agrees that all these other people are gods. In fact, one of the first commandments is, do not worship any other gods other than me. And this is a extremely telling statement, because God is believing all of these other gods, but he's telling the Israelites, you don't worship those guys, you worship me. He's a very selfish God, very jealous God, things like that. And if you look at the oldest of the Canaanites, right before this period happens, here we have a picture of Yahweh and his son, which is named Baal, by the way. And then in the background, looks like she's reading a newspaper, is Asherah. These were all gods that were of that pantheon that they had here. And whenever they started the Bible, they had a pantheon too. Just like in Genesis, how it says, let's make man in our image. And there are 5 or 6 places through the Bible that keeps giving this our and this pluralness, showing you that they were multi-god worshippers. This was a pantheon. Some people refer to it as a council of gods, but this would be nothing different than the council of gods we see around Zeus, that we see around Marduk, and other gods before him, and so on. But this depiction that we show of this devil inside this book, this Codex Gigas, doesn't look like what we call usually the devil, because we've twisted that all around into somebody who looks like the FTD florist, or an elfin type creature with pointy ears, and he's got a pitchfork, which is a trident. So whenever they tried to disavow their own religion, after trying to change it and becoming a totally new person after the exile in Babylon and coming back, they changed this. But if you look, Yahweh here is actually a cow god, so is Baal, so is Asherah, and that's so you understand they're talking about the time of Taurus. And again, leading into the time of Aries, which would be a goat god, and they have horns too, much like Pan and so on. But they wanted to disavow after it started falling apart, and so they made up all these things about what the devil was and so on. Versus, it's funny how they try to give you this idea of what he was, and then you look in the Old Testament and you're like, that ain't it. They try to talk about the serpent in the Garden of Eden and how that was probably Satan. Well, it's not. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's somebody who's a trickster god who comes in and says, well, why can't you eat of this? And she goes, well, he said that if we ate of it, we'll die. And he goes, you won't die. You'll become as wise as the gods. And they know that. You won't die. And then they eat of it, and they became smart, apparently. But they didn't become as smart as they should have, you see, because if this narrative was correct, the first thing would have done afterwards is eat from the tree of life and become immortal and so on. But that didn't happen, right? But God said that they would die that day, and then they didn't. And there's no apologetic that reaches upon anything that you could grasp as being really true. I've heard a lot of different versions of it, of course, but this is, again, just Caucasian mythology, basically, of older times. And something that I can't believe that we're still under as a people, seeing all of these representations and these concepts. And, of course, the fact that they had slavery and their God even gave them an edict and what to do about it and all these type of things. But we were also the people that stopped slavery whenever God condones it, so we must be going against God. No, not necessarily. God's going against humanity. And we stop that as a people. Although these people can't look deep enough into it to realize the truth of the whole thing and how it's actually not true. But this creature that's seen on there, well, here's another picture of Yahweh as a bull. At the time, he was a god of Edom, but that's one of the lower pantheons people in El's pantheon. Now, El is known as Cronus or Saturn, and they talk about the Most High. In fact, whenever they dictate it out, like I said a minute ago, in Numbers and what's the other one? Kings or something, it says the same thing, but they ask Israel to name him, and then in the other version of it, they ask Satan to name him. What is up with that? Like he's just there and doing it, and so on. It's kind of strange. But you'll hear them talk about the Most High God, which they do in that, when the Most High broke everything apart and gave the people their own gods, that Israel is this God's. But if you look at the Most High, we're actually talking about Saturn, because it is the farthest away, visibly seen planet, which means wandering star in the sky. And these people used to have a lot of their deification built on astrology astronomy and astrotheology, if you will. But so that's the Most High, and that's Saturn. But that also, in the same statement there, shows you that that's not the same thing as even Yahweh. They've got a God that's over Yahweh, that gives Yahweh a people. And they're just the Israelites, because everybody else has their own gods, right? So what we have here is the Most High as being Saturn. Well, strangely enough, the ancient Canaanites used to worship Saturn. Some people call him Cronus, like the god of time, chronometry, all of that. And the other name of Saturn, Cronus, is El. And it's all over the Bible, but you don't usually notice it. Where they may go to a Temp El or a Chap El. The elders understood this fact. It's as big as an elephant. El is looked at as being in all the angels' names too. If you look at Angel, you'll then see that their names are Michael, which is Micah El, Gabriel, Ariel, Raphael. So this is the God of the ancient Canaanites, or Israelites, if you will. Same people. Still looks like a Taco Bell. They just got a different place. And it's one of those things you can pull up to it and you go, this place used to be a Taco Bell. If you're paying attention. But this idea of a Satan has really nothing to do with it. Even the Bible, they don't talk about Satan. Although whenever you get into the Septuagint, they refer to Hades and so on into there. But of course, that's a Greek belief of the afterlife. And strangely, these afterlives are very similar to each other. In fact, the one of the Bible, Sheol, is pretty much mimicking the same story that's given in the Epic of Gilgamesh for the afterlife of these people and the underworld, not necessarily heaven, because nobody really gets to go to heaven. They'd have to be real special, and there were a few people, because they're real special, taken up to heaven and then deified. But the rest of us all, apparently, are Sheol, and we're in the ground. Well, of course we are. We're buried and everything, but we're not still alive, suffering in the ground or anything like that. But the Bible talks about Sheol, and also Jesus talks about Gehenna. That was a place that had a lava seeping and tar pits and stuff, and they used to sacrifice their children to this and in this fire and put them into the fire and so on, and later it just became a garbage dump because it would automatically burn the garbage. So walking through this area, it's like a smoky area with all kinds of things, and just looks somewhat similar, but people took that to the nth degree and expounded upon it, made it worse and worse and worse. And next thing you know, we've got all kinds of stupid things about devils. And I've done an earlier video about devils. You could probably just look up devil under my thing and see a couple of videos I've made about this concept. But this one is really about this one creature here that's in the Codex Gigas. And if you look at it, it's just mimicking the Egyptian god Ammit, who is in the book of coming forth by day, or the book of the dead. And once they've gone through their trials and tribulations, going through this whole adventure, having to kill off all kinds of things and make their way through stuff and get to a point, and so they have to know what to do. So they used to give them a book that was like a cheat sheet for it, so they wouldn't forget. But when they get to the end there, Thoth shows up. There's a scale that's there, and there's a creature there that's sitting there looking at it, who has a lion's mane and a crocodile's mouth, lion's claws, and so on. And he's supposed to eat your heart if it ends up weighing more than a feather. And of course, that shows you how hard it is to get into heaven, because you're supposed to have no regrets, pretty much, things like that. And so it's hard to get past that point in humanity whenever all of us have some regrets somewhere. But that creature in that Codex Gigas is not the devil that we think of. That's Amit. If you look at him, he's got a green face, he's got a crocodile face poking out of a lion's mane, with horns on him and claws that are like a lion and so on, with a split forked tongue like a snake. So that's where this comes from, and this idea goes. So what the hell is this? Oh, it's mythology. Is it true? Oh, definitely not. In fact, whenever you die, there's no crocodile, hippopotamus, lion mix thing that's going to be eating you and so on. It just makes no sense. And in a modern day, we can all see that that's untrue. But I can't believe there's so many people still caught up in this whenever it's been torn apart repeatedly. And now there are theologians which are tearing apart the Bible on every single aspect and showing you in places that they mimic the Greek tales of Iliad and the Odyssey and so on, and it's all thrown in there. And then other tales like, well, Moses' birth story, where he gets put into a basket and covered in bitumen and floated down a river, picked up by nobility. That's the birth story of Sargon of Akkad. In fact, that's happening all the way through it. And most people don't even know that at the very first of it, when they get into the idea of Abraham, Abraham left Ur. He was grown up in Samaria. They give that idea. And it says that he left there to go and worship other gods. So apparently the gods of creation were these Sumerians, but that's a whole pantheon and very much different than what comes across that we have now. But believe you me, it was a whole pantheon with a family, and he had 70 kids, so there's all kinds of different people in the pantheon of El, of the Bible. But I just thought I would touch upon the idea of a devil. I watched a video, saw a little thing, and I'm like, what the hell? No pun intended. So I hope you appreciate the understanding of this right here, but this is a lion's mane on a crocodile face, basically mixed with a hippo, with a forked tail like a snake and claws like a lion. It's just things that you're all scared of, and so you better straighten up. In fact, you should never get out of line if you can. And that's what this fear brought upon people before, and you'll still see remnants of it to this day. Was any of it true? Well, looking back at it, now that we've been forced to paganize all of these, we realize that all these other gods must have been false, but for some reason we still believe in this other one, where a woman grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking serpent told her to. That talking serpent, of course, is not Satan in any way. Serpents were just wise things, and in fact dragons were viewed as being much wiser, and a wise walking talking serpent is a dragon. And it's also the story of how the serpent lost its legs and became a snake. Was that true? No, that's evolution from way back. Back whenever there was dinosaurs, there was already snakes. And it somewhat evolved alongside out of reptile type creatures. And we know nowadays that a lot of these dinosaurs were actually feathered and so on. In fact, what happened at 65 million years ago to destroy all the dinosaurs was so violent on the planet, it's amazing we made it out of it. But at that same time, it turned dinosaurs into chickens. It's the way I used to put it to people to understand, because a lot of these raptors and so on were feathered, and they know that now. Of course, we also know that the world is hundreds of billions of years ago, 4.5 billion years ago. So what does it have to do with 6,000 years ago? The earth was created by this special guy that, again, made a woman grow from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking wise serpent told her to. Is that true? No, not in any way. Not in any way. Anyhow, people, I think we'll go on after that. That's pretty much it there. But What is this? Well, that's one depiction of the devil before we ended up with the one that we have now. But that's still just a falsity, just something that's not there. You look at the icon of a Dodge Demon car, and you're like, oh, that's got to be him and everything. Well, that's something that we made up a long time ago too. Yeah, the Caucasian people that made up all this mythology and which became religions, by the way, have a pretty creative mind on these things. And what's weird is people believe this. And if you were to tell somebody people believe this kind of crap a couple of thousand years ago, but they don't anymore, you could probably understand it and you'd be like, wow, man, they used to believe some weird crap. But believe it or not, some remnant of that is still going on to this day, isn't it? Oh, and people still believe stuff like this. I find it hilarious that the Afrocentrics all the time try to turn around and put the devil on the Caucasian people who are actually God's chosen people in the first place, which the Bible tells about, and the Bible doesn't talk about Congoids. And it's hard to get past that point with people, but you might easily be able to say, well, show me Oriental people in the Bible. And they go, okay, I did this with my brother, and he had a little issue with it, and I go, let's just drop this and go with another one. Show me Oriental people. And then he realized that the gig was up, and then he told me that that's the reason they call it faith. And I was like, well, this is the reason we call it bullshit. See how that works? Anyhow, guys, going on to the next one. Let me know what you think down below. Have a good one. Peace.